Well, we're going to turn to a participative exercise next, very shortly, dissecting a cohort study. And if you pull out your copy or bring up on your computer this paper by Graham et al., Cardiovascular Bleeding and Mortality Risk in Elderly Medicare Patients, treated with dabigatran or warfarin for non-valvular atrial fibrillation. And I'm going to try to, channel Marc Suchard, who prepared these slides and is here. What we're going to be doing is spending some time as a team, as little teams of 2 to 4, looking at two main things. One is, as Patrick's alluded to, is really important that we be able to specify a study in such a way that it can be reproduced by others, it could be run in a network study, etc. And then the second is, as we're going to be looking at this paper, do we think that this produces high quality evidence? What are the shortcomings in their approach? So reproducibility and the reliability of the study is two things we're going to consider. So who has not had a chance to read the paper? A few, okay. So the first time I did this, I hadn't read it. It was just right in front of me. So you should be able to get some value out of it anyhow. So we're now going to try to take this new user retrospective cohort design and identify these 5 things, as Patrick's defined, the target and comparator cohorts. How are these populations made more exchangeable? How is the outcome cohort defined? What's the time at risk for the outcome? How are outcome rate differences estimated and assessed? So that's the methodology of analysis. What's the time at risk? The TC and O that we've discussed. So we're going to be trying to look at this paper. What are the things that we can't determine from the paper? You know, are the billing codes available for the target and comparative cohorts? Is the time at risk clearly defined? And we're going to spend approximately 25 minutes, I think, maybe 25 minutes going over these. So the first thing, what are the target comparative cohorts? Just from the floor, can anyone say you've read the paper? What's the target cohort? Comparator cohort? Warfarin's the reference, right? Inclusion-Exclusion criteria. Are there medical concepts or the vocabulary terms for the inclusion-exclusion criteria in there? Some of them?
I couldn't hear from Marc. What did you define the target cohort as?
New users of dabigatran. All right. So is this everything that we could say about the target and comparator cohorts in terms of inclusion, exclusion criteria? There's a lot more. So what we're going to do is have you go into groups of 2 to 4, so you can either turn around, face each other, or work with the person next to you, whatever seems most convenient. And we're going to have you take this study and really look at it from the point of view, could I reproduce it in terms of having clarity on the target, comparator cohorts, TC and O? Is the time at risk clear? Is the modeling procedure clear? So could I reproduce it? And second, given what they've done, do I think the evidence generated is reliable? Do I have any critiques for that? And so we will circulate around the room and try to help you. So Marc, Patrick, Martijn, and myself. And let's start the clock running probably by around 10:40. We'll give you about, let's see, it's 15. Maybe 10:45. Go till 10:45. Just have you discuss this among each other. So please form groups of 2 to 4, and let's get rolling.
Not the
All right.
bag,
Well, thank you everyone for
whatever it is.
participating. You probably could have spent another half an hour easily on that, right? No? So again, we're going to be looking at what are the things that are unclear about the paper, and the reliability of the evidence. What's your overall impression of the paper? Pretty good?
It's awesome.
It's a good paper. It's state of the art. What could we reproduce the study as they did it? Well, we'll see. So the TNC cohorts, elderly greater than 65. Is this everything that defines the cohort? We either initiated dabigatran or warfarin? No, right? Do we have the codes for the target and comparator cohort definitions? Are they in the paper? No. So could we reproduce that? We could. We'd have to make some assumptions, right? We have to do our own scanning of ICD-9 codes.
Yeah, something.
Well, the supplements included, right? And so it turns out the outcome cohort has billing codes, but not the inclusion criteria. There's no billing codes for that. The index date, first prescription date.
Dude, you need to clean your screen, man. You should see my card switch.
So one of the standards that we use when we're defining our inclusion criteria is to just talk about inclusion, and that exclusion can be described just as the inverse. And so rather than saying we exclude people under 65, the inclusion is everyone 65 and up. And so these are some of the, quote, exclusion criteria. We could have written them as the inverse of being included. So we exclude less than 6 months, or we could say we include those who have greater than or equal to 6 months. So what else are we missing here? Other? Mm-hmm. What else? Less than 65? Say that?
Disabled with kidney disorders.
So we exclude those who are disabled or have kidney disorders. Uh-huh.
Hospice or hospitalization.
Yep. Hospice, hospitalization.
Had prior treatment with drug exposure of rivaroxaban or any other anticoagulants.
Okay. So the novel oral anticoagulants couldn't have had those. Here they are. Skilled nursing facility. If they're undergoing dialysis, is it clear when? Anytime ever before? Mm-hmm. Right. Is there a clear washout of a fixed time interval? Is that specified? So if you had 5 years of data for some people prior and 6 months of data, could it differ? Right. So it's not clear is when that atrial fibrillation diagnosis has to be. Do they just say at any time ever? The index, sometime during that index visit, 6 months before? Yeah. So these are some of the ambiguities if we were to reproduce the study, right? We don't have billing codes for all of these these things.
Can I ask a question about the Medicare enrollment? Is it A and B and D, or A or B and D, or? Does it have to be throughout the entire study period that you're enrolled?
I don't know. Is it clear on the paper? It said A, B, and D. But you're saying they have to be all the way through all the time? I don't know. Yeah.
It's not clear. I would assume that they have enrollment in all three, but that's an assumption, not explicit. And are there medications in A or all drugs are all in D? All prescription drugs are in D.
Right.
No. Any drug, all drugs are in D. So in theory, you have to have D for sure. A and B is giving you basically all your medical claims, and D is giving you all your prescription drugs.
Right.
It specifies A, B, and D.
Yeah, but do they the whole time you have to be in all three of them?
Right. It'll talk about.
And C went the same place as the CDM version 3?
No,
Right.
they're just excluding special Medicare people.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really the question. They don't say why.
Yeah.
I mean, we can guess.
So what about all these outcomes prior to exposure in terms of potential exclusion? Is it clear on that? No. And as was discussed earlier, what's the deal with the washout in terms of prior treatment? Is it 6 months before? Is it any time before? Is that clear? And so in terms of this exchangeability, what have they done to balance the cohorts? Is the propensity scoring model clear what they did? You saw these covariates. Not everyone noticed there's a second table in the supplementary material of additional covariates that were used in the propensity scoring. It's not, is it said explicitly these balancing standardized mean differences that it's either before or after? Presumably after, because we were so clean, right? But we don't have the the scores pre-matching, correct?
Does it matter?
What's that?
Does it matter what it was pre-matching? Why does it matter?
Why does it matter?
Pre-matching.
Well, it might be interesting, like what are we throwing out, right? What are the covariates that are really imbalanced? Is there a whole segment of the population that's excluded by that matching criteria? Anyone else have any other thoughts on why we would want both pre and post?
You might want to know if, like, for example, if you had very few people in a certain subgroup, like very few women or something, and let's say there's only like 1% women, 99% men, and then you balance it, it's 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
So now that 1% of that subgroup is now usually maybe overrepresented.
Right. So he's saying that, if you had a real imbalance in one of the classes, such as sex, and then you drop all of the other members of the opposite class, in the case, say, we had to have an equal number of females and males, and there's only 1% females, they would be kind of driving the whole study, this little subgroup. So it would be good to have those diagnostics. Probably didn't say it as clearly as you, but
I mean, what is often overlooked, you read the paper, just read the title of the paper. The title doesn't say the effect of dabigatran in a matched subset that satisfied a whole bunch of criteria. It just says the effect of dabigatran. And the question is that analytical cohort, the group that's matching, can you actually generalize to the target population you started with, which was all new infusion of dabigatran? So you need to look at what the group was before so that you can actually understand, can you actually project what you're using to the group that you were going for.
Right. How about the choice of covariates that they used for matching? Was anyone have a thoughts on whether that was a good comprehensive set?
I thought that was very thorough.
You'd thought some questions about mobility for warfarin?
Yeah, but then when you pointed out the additional covariates in the supplemental table.
So he was pointing out to me in an earlier discussion that with warfarin you have to come back and get repeated blood draws and so forth, and if you were perhaps less mobile, you might be less likely to be prescribed warfarin. And so then he was saying, is there a covariate for that? Oh, well, there was whether they're in a wheelchair, and so yeah, perhaps there was a good correction for mobility factors.
So in the list of covariates of the supplemental material, I see some concomitant medication like on 3 drug classes. Probably the list could be broader and to
Right.
account for any potential, interaction.
Right.
So maybe the list could be
Right.
broader.
So Sergio concerned that the list of concomitant medications might be a little small, a little incomplete. Mhm.
This may be covered in later talks, but I'd like to bring it up. So if after the diagnosis you see the target cohort and comparative cohort is not very well matched, and then you drop some covariate or redo the matching, or what is the choice you can?
So the question of if you see them not well matched, I think perhaps Martijn might be talking about trimming and so forth a little later with propensity scoring. Is that correct, Martijn?
Not specifically trimming,
No?
but I can bring it up. Sure.
Okay. Perhaps when we cover that a little
Yes.
later. But good question. Moving on. So here's our outcome definitions: risk of stroke, GI, intracranial bleeding, acute myocardial infarction, mortality, all-cause mortality. So were they well defined? Was there a table of those? In the supplements, they actually do have the billing codes for the outcomes, correct? Now, were those all the appropriate codes? You know, as subject matter experts, we'd have to look at that. Interestingly, they cite some earlier studies, and Marc was saying to me that these earlier studies where there's a high positive prediction value for these different outcomes, they actually didn't use the exact same lists from some of these earlier studies. So, and then when they talk a little later about comparison with another of their published studies, the mini sentinel study, I think it was reference 30, if I'm not mistaken, where there was a twofold increased risk of GI bleed. Were they doing an apples-to-apples comparison? That was their study as well. And so did they keep things the same? It appears not. But you weren't assigned to read the other paper. So the outcome, time at risk, so they were using Cox proportional hazards model. And they put a whole bunch of things into right censoring, correct? So the first of all of these different events could be right censoring or one of the outcomes of interest. What do you think the impact of lumping all these into competing risks? Is it the same having a end of study data versus start of hospice? RX fill for a different anticoagulant, right? Switching a drug maybe due to, maybe they had some unintended, some side effect that was unpleasant. So they are removed from the study going forward, right? So they're counted in the numerator-denominator survival analysis up till one of these things happens. And these are very different types of events, right? It's much more severe having dialysis. And so when we do a Cox regression, we just have one outcome, and then we lump everything else into this right censored category. And there's a body of knowledge called competing risks and competing risks regression, where you can model those separately. And it turns out when you lump together these different things, you often get an overestimate of the risk for the outcome of interest. How do they assess, the authors assess the reliability of their estimates? Don't everyone speak at once. What should they do?
For the outcome for ischemic stroke, they provide positive rate.
Mm-hmm. They have some confidence intervals, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll be talking a little later about the use of negative controls to measure residual bias. So they did also do some sensitivity analysis. So they tried, now, do they show the results of those sensitivity analysis? Did you see it? They had a statement saying, well, the results were comparable. Right? It was like a one sentence. They did, for instance, there was a 3-day gap allowed between drugs, between fills in the main study, and then they said, well, let's change that and put it to 14 days. So when we're going here to the discontinuation of the drug, so by the way, this is not an intent to treat model, correct? So you know the difference. Intent to treat means I start on a given drug, and what happens after, I don't necessarily enforce that I'm on the same drug, but they said we stop the clock if there's a discontinuation of the drug, and so then it's a parameter of the analysis, or a parameter of the data staging, to say, is it 3 days, is it 14 days, is it 30 days? And that'll be an option that we'll see in Atlas later that we can use. Look at my screen is going off. And so if you now have bigger gaps, and we have some notion of duration of exposure, cumulative exposure. Oh, the cable's jiggled on me, right? It's in there. About as tight as it can get. All right. So they do a lot of subgroup analysis. What are the problems with that? Well, they list about 6 or so different subgroup analysis. There could be concern about multiple testing, going on sort of a fishing expedition. All right, loss of power can happen with subgroup analysis. Generally, we'd like to use interaction terms in our outcome regression model.
They didn't even test the right subgroups. They forgot the whole role of ethnicity and race in this particular disease state. That's like well documented by their other molecules.
It's a good point here that, and I'm just repeating for the recording that they didn't look at different ethnic subgroups where there's known risk factors. They make some claim that there's this increased risk of major GI bleeding with dabigatran for women 75 and men age 85. That sounds like there's some multiple testing going on where they, pick these particular thresholds and so forth. But if you adjust for the multiple testing and so you can increase the confidence limits, is it clear that there's any difference among these different subgroups? Looks like there's an overlap of these confidence limits. Now, maybe what they're trying to say is, well, this was, an odds that was totally this side of, on a log scale 0 or unlogged to be this side of 1 for those who were 75 and above for women and 85 and above for men. However, in the case, if you account for multiple testing, that's not even the case here with the men 85 and above. And then this statement, the magnitude of effect for each outcome was greater in the subgroup treated with dabigatran 150 mg twice daily compared with the main analysis. So we've plotted their confidence intervals. And is it clear that there's a difference between the entire study, the 150 mg study? Perhaps not. One thing that's important is to have some estimate of confidence. There's no error bars on the Kaplan-Meier plots. And so the human eye looks at these curves and says, well, yeah, they look different. But unless you have a shaded error bar, as we'll see in some graphs, it's hard to say. Who knows? Yes?
In the subgroup analysis, this is a one-to-one matching, right?
Yes.
So in subgroup analysis, you see women younger than 75 versus older than 75, and then if the matched pair, not both of them are older than 75, you lost it in the subgroup analysis?
So it's a good question. So in the matching, how does this subgroup analysis work? Is if someone was slightly under 75, but they were fairly reasonably matched, would they have been plucked out? Again, good question, hard to say, right? And so this is really the thing where we have just the human readable form of the study, right? And as we're going to be looking a little later with Atlas, we're going to have, the human readable form and the machine readable form. And so in a sense, you can look at the source code, look at the procedures that are run, and be able to figure out just precisely what was done. I think we can probably wrap it up now for sake of time. We're at the end of our time by a little bit. And I think we're going to a break now. Is that right, Patrick? So thank you very much for your participation. I hope this gives you a good feel for interpreting a study, and then some of the things that we don't want to make the mistakes of making it hard for others to reproduce our study. And so we're going to learn how to do our own study in the time to come, and we'll take a little break here until 11:20, please. Thank you very much.